Hi guys, my name is Nate Bruling. I sit across the street over in sales, look after the Microsoft business, so nice to meet you. We're here today because of a good friend of mine, Eric Fay, was talking to me about this fantastic story and this incredible woman and team behind her as well. So he asked, hey, would it be possible to have a chat at Google? And I said, absolutely, let's do this. So I have the pleasure of introducing Barbara Arrowsmith-Young today. And today's talk is going to be about a personal journey into the world of the brain, shaping the mind. Such a cool title, right? Very exciting. I've got 3 kids, so I'm watching my kids develop over the years, and it's just been incredible to me. And I cannot wait to see what we're about to see, so I'm going to be quick. But before I bring her up, a bit more about her. She holds a Bachelor in Applied Science Child Studies, a Master's in School Psychology from the University of Toronto. Her work began in 1978. And it's been recognized as one of the first examples of practical application of neuroplasticity, which simply means, the ability of the brain to change and rewire itself over one's lifetime. It's fantastic. The genesis of the program lies in Barbara's own journey of discovery and innovation to overcome her learning disabilities, a description of which appears in her book that you guys have, so thank you for bringing those today, and there'll be a signing afterwards. The name of that book is titled The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. Many reviewers have written about her book. To share one of the quotes, I really like this one. It will open your mind to new possibilities and how to deal with traffic jams in the brain. So I know a lot of us, especially Google, we have a lot of traffic jams. Sounds fitting. Her life has been a quest to help individuals address learning difficulties so they can experience the ease and joy of learning, as well as achieve their dreams. This program is in over 91 schools across several countries: Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Thailand, and South Korea. So really excited to have her here. Let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, guys, one more thing before we start. Please silence your phones. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Eric Fay for making the introduction, and thank you, Nate, for providing me the opportunity to speak about what I'm most passionate about, which is our human brain, its incredible complexity, and the possibility for change. It's sort of what I'm probably most passionate about in the world. And my life and my work has really been an exploration of the territory of the human brain, how it makes us uniquely who we are. Because when we think about our brain, it filters our perceptions of ourselves and our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of other people, our understanding of the world, and our understanding of our relationship to that. So really, really critical in terms of mediating our experience. And to me, what's really promising is not only does our brain shape who we are, but now we know with this concept of neuroplasticity that we can actually shape our brain if we can understand how we can harness those principles. And also, I think what's really interesting, we often hear the comment about he or she is just not good at that. And we also often attribute, not being good at something as coming out of maybe an emotional base. That person is just rude or they're not good socially. And I would like to encourage people to start to look at behavior through a cognitive lens. I mean, behavior is multiply determined. It's not just cognitive, but I think we ignore the cognitive. If there's any part of our brain that isn't fully operational or functioning, it will have an impact in terms of our behavior. And I'm going to take you a little bit into that world today. So science has taught us that, as I said, our brain really does shape us. And if we think about how complex it is, we have something on the order of 86 billion neurons that we're carrying around in our head. And to put that into perspective, the world's population is somewhere between 7 and 8 billion. So incredible complexity. And we have several 100 trillion connections or superhighways in the brain connecting different regions for neurotransmission and communication. And again, to put that into perspective, we have more connections in our brain than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So incredibly complex. And we can't really escape our brain because we carry it everywhere we go. Also, what I find really fascinating is no two brains are exactly alike. So if you think about somebody that you know well, or you look at somebody sitting next to you, and you note that there are physical differences between the two of you. I mean, you have different eye color, different shape of your nose, different shape of your ears, there are actually more differences between your two brains than all of those physical differences combined. So our brain really does make us uniquely who we are. And to me, as I said, what's really, really promising is this concept of neuroplasticity. We now know that we can actually grow new neurons in the brain, in the hippocampus, which is really important for memory and for learning. We know that we can increase neurotransmitters. We know that we can increase the branches, the dendrites on the neurons to enhance neurotransmission. So we can actually change our brain. So my story begins with my brain. And it's really a story of a quest and a hunt for a solution to my very severe learning disabilities that were identified in grade 1. So it's a very personal story, but it's also universal in that each and every one of us has a brain that impacts our functioning. And if we think about having a brain that's capable and incapable at the same time, that's the experience of someone with a learning difficulty. There are things that we can do very easily, and then there are other things that with the best will in the world, they're really incredibly challenging. And that certainly was my experience. So for me, growing up, I lived in a world that was about as intelligible as Lewis Carroll's poem, The Jabberwocky. I didn't understand it at the time, that, I couldn't process language. It was almost like I heard the words. I mean, I knew what the words were, but I struggled to interpret them, to attach meaning to them. So for me, I could understand things very concretely. I mean, if somebody said it's raining outside, which I understand it does quite a bit here in Seattle, I could understand that because I could conjure up a visual image of rain. But as soon as it got abstract, conceptual, it was impossible to me. Something as simple as, I couldn't understand how my aunt could also be my mother's sister. I could not understand how could somebody have two relationships. In terms of numbers, I mean, I could understand 1 because I could, put one object up here. I could understand 4 because I could line up, 4 objects. You put that 1 over top of a 4, which is a relationship of a part to a whole, it meant nothing to me. Bigger than, greater than, less than, under, over, anything that had a relational connotation was incredibly difficult or impossible for me to understand. My notebooks were filled with diagrams. I used my right hemisphere to try to interpret language by making drawings to try to connect the relationships. Things as simple as jokes. I didn't understand jokes because it depends on irony. So, not wanting to feel left out as a child, what I would do is I would laugh as much as everybody else was laughing because I didn't want to feel left out, but I had no idea what they were laughing at. I was really vulnerable to con artists because how do you understand that you're being conned? You hear logical inconsistencies in what person or somebody is saying. Well, for me, there was no logic in my world, so there were no logical inconsistencies. So, I easily, believed what people told me. And something as simple as telling time. I couldn't read an analog clock. In fact, I couldn't read an analog clock until I was 26 and created my first exercise for myself. Because to interpret time, you have to understand the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand, and I couldn't understand that relationship. So any kind of abstract ideas, concepts were hard. I got identified in grade 1 as being rigid and stubborn. And I really was rigid and stubborn, but again, not coming from an emotional place, it was a cognitive difficulty. Because for me, any kind of understanding was so hard won. So if I came to understand something, I wanted to hold on to it for dear life. And if somebody said, well, think about another way of doing something, think about an alternative, it felt like I had to let go of this that was so hard for me to grasp to integrate something else. And I just felt my whole world would fall apart. So maybe in your lives you know somebody that's really rigid and stubborn, and it might be because they can't compare and contrast. They can't see alternatives or weigh decisions or differences. And what ended up happening in my life was that very fragmented and fractured view of my world because nothing connected. There was no cause and effect in my world. In fact, I thought there was some puppet master up there pulling strings because I couldn't understand why things happened. It led to an incredibly fractured and fragmented sense of myself. And I described my world as living in a fog where meaning was just ephemeral and it would disappear into a mist of just uncertainty. And kind of joked that I lived in amygdala hell. I was terrified all the time because I didn't understand the meaning of what was happening around me. So, and if that wasn't enough, I had another difficulty. So I had multiple, what would be considered multiple learning disabilities. So I struggled to register the location of sensation on the left side of my body. So most people, if you go to put your hand on a hot burner, your brain is going to tell you pain. It's going to tell you pain in your left hand, pull it up. And I mean, it's going to be just an automatic process. I mean, you're not going to stop and think about it. Well, for me, my brain would tell me pain, but it wouldn't register where the pain was coming from. So I'd leave my hand on the hot burner, which really wasn't very good idea. So I learned probably around age 3 or 4 that I had to watch the left side of my body because it would do things. It was almost like an alien being. It would do things. I slammed a car door on my head once with my left hand and, shattered a tooth. My mother was convinced by probably about age 5 that I would not live very long because I was so accident prone. But it was a cognitive area that just wouldn't register the location of sensation. And imagine me on a sports team, right? I mean, I struggled academically. Nobody wanted me on their sports team in school. And I understood why. Like, I truly wasn't an asset because I was so clumsy. And ended up, being bruised and banged and kind of battered. And then imagine me driving a car. If I didn't know where the left side of my body was, once I started to drive a car, I didn't know where the left side of that car was. So not only was my body bruised and banged, it was actually my parents' car, because when I first started driving, their car was bruised and banged and dented on the left side by extension. And then there was another area that wasn't working. The area that allows you to represent three-dimensional space inside your head. I couldn't do that. So I couldn't create maps inside my head. Geography, geometry, any activity, chess, checkers, that involved a spatial component was really, really hard for me. And again, things that we take for granted, like crossing the street, was really terrifying. Because when you cross the street, what you actually do, kind of automatically, is you create a mental map of where you are relative to that car coming at you. I couldn't do that, so I had no idea where I was relative to that car. So my compensation was to walk blocks out of my way to find a stop sign or a stoplight where I knew cars had to stop and then would be relatively safe crossing. Or my other strategy was to wait by the side of the road until somebody else came along to cross, and I would follow them, and I would pray that they didn't have the same difficulty that I did and that we'd get across, safely. And I used to joke that I would be as safe crossing the street with my eyes closed as with my eyes open, which was probably pretty accurate because I couldn't do that spatial representation. And I would always get lost because for me there were no maps. I didn't even understand that streets connected. So I couldn't hold any kind of spatial representation in my head. So anytime I went somewhere, I had to calculate in what I called lost time. So I would always give myself extra time because I knew I would get lost, several times before I finally found my way. And so those were some of the areas, the main ones that I struggled with. And so for me, when I began my schooling in the 1950s, it was in the time of what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. So when I started in grade 1, the traditional belief was if you have a learning problem or there's a problem in your brain, nothing you can do about it. Basically, the brain you're born with is the brain you die with. There was no concept of neuroplasticity. In fact, people believed there was no such thing as neuroplasticity, most people. So in grade 1, I overheard my teacher tell my mother that I had a mental block, because this was before the term learning disability had even been invented. And being very concrete, I just actually imagined that I had a piece of wood, like a nice wooden cube, lodged in my head that made learning really difficult. And later I learned I didn't have a wooden cube, but in a sense I had blockages. There were parts of my brain that weren't working properly. But imagine, like in grade 1, I was given a life sentence, told that I would never learn like other children, that all of my academic career would be an incredible struggle, and that I was really condemned to living in that world of disconnected elements and confusion and fog. And that really was my experience going through school. I mean, I did eventually learn how to read and to write and do kind of simple numeracy. I used my strengths. I have a verbatim auditory memory. I can listen to things in just like a little tape recorder, remember them. And I have a photographic visual memory. So, I can look at print and remember. And that's what got me through. And I had incredible drive and determination. So I never understood anything. I could memorize it and then, match it up on the exam. And I would get anywhere from 10% on exam to 100%, depending if I made the right match. The 10% I made a really bad match because I didn't really understand what was being asked. The 100%, I made a better match. Probably really didn't understand what was going on, but I just was lucky to make a better match. But what my teachers would conclude, if I could get 100% at one point and I got 10%, I must not have worked very hard for that 10%. And I worked as hard for the 10% as I did for the 100%. So certainly, it was a confusing picture for teachers. So I was very, very lucky. My father was a scientist and an inventor, had something on the order of 40 patents. He conditioned electricity. And I kind of caught that creative passion from him. I really didn't understand anything that he was doing, but I felt that, that desire to create. And he told me as I was growing up, he said, if there's a problem in your life and there's no solution out there in the world, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and find a solution to the problem. Kind of probably like what all of you do here, you find solutions to problems. And he also said something really wise that I've taken with me through my life. He said, don't be limited by conventional wisdom. He said, the rest of the world tells you can't do this. He said, ignore them, don't listen, go out and do it. So I set on a quest to try to find a solution to my difficulties. And for me, the solution came two brilliant researchers. The first one, Alexander Luria, a Russian neuropsychologist doing a lot of work in Russia after World War II, where there were a lot of Russian soldiers with very localized head wounds. And what he would do was investigate clinically by giving them tests to try to understand if there's damage to this part of the brain, what can the person no longer do? Therefore, by inference, what does that part of the brain do? And he's really one of the seminal thinkers in neuropsychology and neuroscience that started to map the brain many, many years ago. So he helped with identification of the function of different parts of the brain. And I came across a book that he had written called The Man with the Shattered World. And it was a story of a Russian soldier who, in 1943, in the Battle of Smolensk, had a shrapnel wound to a part of his brain in the left hemisphere, very localized wound. And as I read this man's story, I thought, this man is living my life, several decades earlier and halfway around the world in Russia. He was using the same language in his journal, talking about living in a fog where meaning was ephemeral and would disappear, that I was using in my journal, decades later and in Canada. So I had an epiphany at that point, because I knew I had terrible problems, but I had no idea what the source of the problems were. And to solve a problem, you kind of have to get an idea of what the nature of the problem is. So now I knew the nature. I knew it was part of my brain that wasn't working properly. So that was great, but then what do I do about that? The next piece of the puzzle came in the work of Mark Rosenzweig. And he was in Berkeley working with rats, because they're a lot easier to work with than people. And what he was doing was putting rats in a really enriched environment, with a lot of stimulation. Then he would compare them to rats in a normal or an unenriched environment. And he would put them in little rat intelligence tests, which is running a maze. And he found those rats that had had the enriched experience were able to learn the maze much more efficiently and effectively. And then because they were rats, he cut their heads open and looked at their brains. And what he found was the brains had changed physiologically for those rats that had the enrichment. There were more neurotransmitters. There were more, you can see the slide of the neuron, more dendrites, so more synaptic connections, if there are more dendritic branches, more glia cells, enlarged capillaries, so more blood flowing to the regions. I think there was something like 12 physiological variables that had changed with the enrichment that led to, he inferred, the improved performance on the mazes. So I had to infer, even though nobody was looking at it at that time, or believe that if rats had neuroplasticity, humans, we must have neuroplasticity. And I kind of thought that we probably had more neuroplasticity than rats. So I thought if, I can take Lurie's work and understand the nature of what that part of the brain is supposed to do, what's its job and what's its function, maybe I could find an activity or a task that would stimulate it to make it work. So, and I figured, might not work because the rest of the world was saying it couldn't, but what did I have to lose other than time? And it was 25, 26, I couldn't tell time, so I figured, what does it really matter? Let me try it. And so at the age of 26, I set out with the first exercise, and what did I use? I used clocks. Not that I wanted to get better at telling time, but the concept is you need to force the brain to do what it's designed to do, but what is really difficult. And I couldn't do the relational piece. So I used the clocks to force processing relationships. And I got really fast at reading a two-handed clock, really accurate. I mean, it was pretty abysmal at the beginning. And that was great, so now I could tell time, but I didn't feel any cognitive change. And to drive neuroplastic change, you have to increase novelty and complexity. So what I did is I kept adding more hands, more relationships. And now we have a 10-handed clock, which anybody can benefit. Like the only two people that have ever looked at it and interpreted it, one had discovered quasars, radio-emitting galaxies. He was an astronomer. And the other was a physicist from Harvard. So I knew I was onto something with this really advanced level. And in fact, right now I'm talking to a university in Spain, and they're looking at putting that reasoning exercise into their university. So every student will go into a cognitive lab and work on that exercise 4 hours a week, and over a 10-month span will supercharge that cognitive function in terms of being able to reason. And it's that ability to process relationships simultaneously. It's insight, where you, like all this information, disparate information comes together and you say, aha, that's what that means. That's what this function, is. And also what I found interesting is I've worked with a number of psychiatrists. My head school's in Toronto, and then as Nate mentioned, there's schools all around the world that implement this program. And if somebody has this problem, they can't benefit from insight therapy, because insight therapy means that you have to make cause and effect. You have to see relationships between your behavior and emotions and other people's actions. And as students work on this exercise, if they're in a therapeutic process, what the psychiatrists or psychologists always report is at the level of, it's about the four relationship level of the exercise, they start to benefit from insight therapy. So really very profound capacity, not that's just going to affect the person in school, but in their whole life. And I've had some students that have come to me that have been misdiagnosed as having Asperger's, which is a high-functioning autism, because they have a severe difficulty in this function. And as we address this function, it's very clear that they don't have Asperger's. It was just they couldn't connect meaning to situations, so they walked around totally disengaged and not able to relate to the world. So pretty important area. And as I worked on this and saw the change, for me, what happened was I could now start to live in what I call real time, whereas before I lived in what I call lag time. Because if I listened to a conversation, I would memorize it. I would have that little tape recorder going, and I would walk away and maybe go over it and over and over for 2-3 hours to try to understand what were those people saying. And in some cases I could, and in some cases I couldn't. But even if I could, it was 3 hours after the conversation, so I couldn't be part of that human discourse. Now I could listen to somebody, I could understand as they were talking, I could actually make a comment and interject, understand what they said back to me. I was actually part of human discourse, and it was very, very profound. I could also now grasp math concepts, I could understand fractions. I went back and taught myself all of elementary, high school, and college mathematics. And now I could understand it from first principles rather than just memorizing formulas and plugging in numbers. I was no longer rigid because I could contrast and compare and weigh decisions and see alternatives. I could understand jokes, I could tell time, and I was no longer vulnerable to con artists. So all of that changed as a result of one cognitive exercise. So then I thought, can I create an exercise to address the two other problems that I talked about. The first one, the somatosensory cortex, which you have two strips in either side of your brain. The somatosensory cortex here controls registering and location of sensation on your left side, and then this one controls the right side. So I knew there to create an exercise, I had to do something with my eyes closed, because my compensation was with my eyes watching what that side of my body was doing, and really regulate movement through vision, not through sensory feedback. So I created a whole complex exercise of doing movements with that side of my body, with my eyes closed, and overcame that problem. I can now register sensation on the left side of my body, the location of sensation. I don't bump into things, I don't trip over my feet, all of that, because I didn't know, if I went to walk out a door, I'd just as likely, hit the door frame as go through the middle of the door, because I didn't know where the side of my body was. So address that. Also, if I picked up something in my left hand, the first row in the audience might end up wearing it because I couldn't regulate movement, so I would overmove or undermove or drop things. I can do all that now. And to me, what's powerful, if we can understand this concept of neuroplasticity, is we're not teaching skills, we're not teaching content, we're not teaching the person how to do, or learn an activity. We're changing the brain's capacity to then learn content, to learn strategies, to learn information. And given that we carry our brain with us everywhere, it's incredibly powerful to go under the content into the brain and stimulate that function. And then the other area, in the parietal, this is a spatial area. And again, I knew to create an exercise there that I had to do something with a spatial component and do it over and over again. So I created an exercise and saw the change. And now, I think in the last 3 years, I've gone around the world a few times talking about this work, and I don't get lost. I can actually read maps, and I can navigate. I can actually go to IKEA and buy one of those, bookcases or cupboards, and go from a two-dimensional representation and build three-dimensional representation, which before I couldn't. I would put the back of the bookcase on upside down and backwards because you can't translate two-dimensional representation into three-dimensional space. I can do that now. And for me, those words, "some assembly required," before would strike terror into my heart. I mean, now I know I can assemble things. And interestingly, my mother, some of these are genetic, inherited. My mother and I both had severe difficulty. And these things work on a continuum. You can be exceptionally strong in an area, you can have average functioning, you can have a mild problem, moderate problem, severe problem. So anywhere on the continuum. My mother and I were at the severe end of this. And as a child, getting into the car with my mother, she had a good attitude. She says it's going to be an adventure because neither of us had any maps in our head. So we kind of knew where we were starting. We knew sort of where we wanted to end up, but it was like a black hole in between. And she said, we'll always get there, which we always did, and we never got there the same way twice. But it was an adventure. But as I got older and kind of understood more about these cognitive functions, I asked her, did this ever have an impact other than it took you longer to get anywhere? And so she shared with me that when she'd gone to university, she'd wanted to be a chemist. But in her first year was encouraged to drop chemistry, and she went into home economics. She couldn't construct those molecules, like that spatial representation inside your head. It was just impossible for her. And I really struggled also with organic chemistry because of this difficulty in university. Interestingly, again, as they work on a continuum, I have 4 brothers, and my oldest brother has this at a mild level. Not enough to interfere with him becoming a chemist, which he did at the University of Toronto, but he became a physical chemist because it still was hard for him to construct those molecules. So what I've learned in this work is that there's no free ride in a sense. Like if there's a cognitive area of difficulty, it will have some impact. It just kind of depends on what it is, the degree that it's there, and what you're doing in your life in terms of, whether it limits you. So in the work that I've created, I currently can identify 19 cognitive functions. And if people are interested, on our website down here at the bottom, there's a cognitive profile questionnaire. I think there's about 250 questions on it. You can go in and answer these questions. It's all confidential. And at the end, based on your responses, it'll give you a profile of where it's by your answers, suggesting that there might be some difficulties. And then you go on the website and read more information if somebody's interested. So currently we have programs for 19 cognitive functions, and I'm very clear that this isn't everything that can go wrong with learning, but it's really broad range from the person that struggles with nonverbal interpretation of situations, face blindness I have a program for, person that can't recognize landmarks, so can't navigate because they don't remember the look of a place, spatial, the person that gets lost because they can't hold maps or three-dimensional representation, auditory memory, the person just can't hold information, numeracy, the person that doesn't understand number. So a broad range of different cognitive deficits. And for me, if you're working on an area, you first need to identify where the problem is. And if anybody hears, somebody say, this one problem is going to fix, or this one program is going to fix everything, I would say, run as quickly as you can in the other direction. Because in terms of the brain, there's no one size fits all. We have an incredibly complex organ here, and I believe for something to work effectively, it has to be differentiated, targeted stimulation to that function. And for example, if we think about reading, this is a blood flow study looking at all the brain areas that come together when somebody is reading. So there is no reading area in the brain. The brain works in what Lurie called a functional system, what we now call a neural network, where multiple areas come together, each one having its own task. So there's eye tracking, there's phonemic awareness, there's sound symbol correspondence to hear the speech sounds, there's the visual memory to hold the speech pattern, eye tracking to learn kind of a motor plan for the eye for reading. All these are critical. So if a child or an individual struggling with reading, it might be any combination of these. The individuals we work with may have different components. The individuals we see that really are probably never going to get past a grade 2 or 3 level of reading unless we do this cognitive work, have all of these areas impacted. So there's no piece that they can use to compensate for their difficulties, because every single one related to reading is problematic. So if you want to see where you are in one of these cognitive functions, and you can keep it confidential. I think probably everybody in the room here has seen a cat at some point in their existence. So this is an area in the right hemisphere that holds the look of things. So if you want to just close your eyes, and you don't have to do it, and see, can you actually see in your mind's eye or call up on a screen an image or a picture of a cat? So whoever wants to try it. And then if you want to open up your eyes and kind of see how you did. So some people are going to see like a really vivid, clear image of the cat. Some people, it will be less clear, and some individuals are just going to see the back of their eyelids. And I often call this the refrigerator dysfunction. This is where the person just doesn't hold the visual details of objects. So they open the fridge door and they say, where's the mustard, or where's the ketchup? So I think you like ketchup better here. We like mustard more in Canada. And they just, because you don't hold the picture of what you're looking for, or you don't like shopping if somebody has trouble here, because you'll walk by what you're looking for multiple times before you just recognize, okay, yeah, that's the Cheerios or whatever it is. You miss details. This will be the person that, their wife maybe goes and, gets a makeover, and they don't notice that, something is different because they're not holding kind of the visual look of what was there before and comparing it to what's there now. If someone's strong here, they'll navigate by landmarks. They'll go someplace once and they'll remember vividly what it looks like and, where they have to turn, or they're really good with visual imagery. I worked with a student that was studying to be an illustrator in Canada, and she had this difficulty, not massively, but enough that when she would draw a cat, she'd leave off the whiskers, or when she'd draw a coat, she'd leave off the buttons. And that was kind of a problem if you're going to be an illustrator, because you need to get the details down. So actually, she was one of the first people I created this exercise for, and we worked on it. She improved this function, and now she's won awards in Canada for her illustrations. So she doesn't miss details anymore. One person I worked with shared with me that she really hated to meditate. She had this difficulty, and I mean, she could do breathing meditation, but she couldn't do visual imagery meditation. So someone would tell her to close her eyes and go to her happy place. Well, she just saw a black screen. So it definitely doesn't necessarily impact the person in school per se in academic learning, but definitely in life. If people know Oliver Sacks's book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, that's this cognitive function. I have worked with some people that have had traumatic brain injury, and one of the students I worked with here had massive right hemisphere damage. He'd been hit by a truck when he was 12, and I saw him when he was in his early 30s. And the first day he came into my school, he tried to exit through a filing cabinet because it was rectangular, it had a handle. To him, it looked like a door. We worked on this, and what was so amazing, not only could he eventually recognize objects and landmarks, but he developed a visual sense of humor because the whole visual world became alive for him, and he could see irony. This area is also related to face blindness and face recognition. So somebody that has a difficulty here, if they see somebody in context, so they see their neighbor on the porch in their front house, they'll know who that person is. 5 minutes later, they'll see that person in the grocery store, no idea who they are. So I have a program that addresses that. And these people often get labeled as rude or standoffish, and it isn't the case. They just don't recognize the person. A good friend of mine had this difficulty, and we worked on it. And she was a reporter at the Toronto Star, which is the second largest newspaper in Toronto. And for 20 years, she rode the elevator up and down, up and down. She had no idea every day that she went into that elevator, did she know anybody on that elevator? So she said she had two options. One, to just assume she knew nobody, and if she offended somebody, so be it, or pretend she knew everybody, and if she got labeled as, you know, being overly friendly. So that was the option she chose. But at one point, she got accused of being prejudicial. A friend said to her, you know, "Oh, Linda, you think all brown people look alike." And Linda said to her, "Actually, it's much worse than that. All people look alike." But because she didn't recognize people and make that discrimination, somebody interpreted her behavior as being prejudiced, which was not accurate. So that's this function. If you want to try, this is the same part of the brain, but now in the left hemisphere. So one is holding the look of the thing, which is in your right hemisphere. This is holding the symbol pattern. So again, if you want to just think of the word cat, so the three letters, and if you want to try and close your eyes, and can you conjure up that those three letters on a blackboard? And again, some people will see it really crisply, some people it will be kind of fuzzy, and a lot of the students that we work with don't see anything. They can't hold the visual look of a word. Some researchers call this the brain's letterbox or visual word form area. I call it symbol recognition, but it's critical for spelling, for word recognition, even learning visual symbol templates like math formulas, chemical equations. We know that you can just learn them visually. If somebody has this difficulty, they don't. And I'll just give you an example of the exercise that we use for this area. So for every single one of the 19 functions, we have very different exercises because we're targeting very different functions. And this language that this student is looking at is Amharic from Ethiopia. And often people say, well, you know, Nick is struggling with reading English, like why are you giving him Amharic? The concept is that we don't want the child or the individual to compensate for the difficulty. So if we used English letters, they could put sound to it, they could put meaning to it. If we use Amharic or Burmese or Sinhalese or Telugu, they can't put sound to it. They can't put meaning to it because they don't know this language. So the idea of any of the exercises, we're trying to go in and target that differentiated stimulation right to the area, removing any possibility of compensation. Now, you can never fully remove compensation because the brain doesn't work that way. So the student goes through a whole process. There's thousands of levels in each of the exercises. And by the end of this exercise, they're holding 8 Chinese characters excuse me, in their mind's eye. And after that, English actually looks pretty easy. But again, it's not that we're teaching a skill, we're changing the brain's capacity to hold symbol patterns. So what you see changes with this is word recognition, spelling, visual matching, visual tracking, anything related to visual symbol, learning visual symbol patterns. And just really quickly, if anybody's interested, we have a number of outcome studies on our website, which is arrowsmithschool.org. So we've had studies done in different schools, different researchers, different research designs, all looking at outcomes. So looking at outcomes on academic measures, looking at outcomes in schools with rate of learning, looking at outcomes on cognitive measures. They're all summarized on the website. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because you can look at it. But this was a study done at the University of Calgary, looking at academic changes. The one I really like is this was done in the Toronto Catholic District School Board, obviously in Toronto. This is a publicly funded board. We know that students with learning difficulties aren't learning a year for a year. So these students were learning about 2/3 of a year per year because they fall further and further behind because they're struggling with their difficulties. We took this group of students, I think there were 60 students, and we put them half a day doing cognitive exercises. So they're actually getting less curriculum than they were getting the previous several years where they were learning 2/3 of a year per year. So now we're reducing their curriculum exposure by half. And what we found a year after the intervention, they were doubling and tripling their rate of learning, having had less academics, because we changed the brain's capacity to learn. I mean, again, keep saying this over and over again, but this is the power of the brain. I mean, you change the capacity of it to learn, the learning just starts to go forward, even when they'd had less exposure. Like these students could have sat in those English classes and those math classes, for year after year after year, and they were still going to be learning at 2/3 of a year per year. It needed the cognitive intervention to shift that. And then we've looked at cognitive measures. Again, this was another study done at the University of Calgary in the Brain Gain Lab, seeing changes on memory, auditory processing, fluid reasoning, as a result of the students working on these cognitive exercises. And to me, what's most exciting is the research studies that we started the last year and a half, 2 years ago, imaging research, because my hypothesis all the way through this work has been it's the brain that's changing. It made sense. That was the inference I made when I started this work, but I didn't have access to this kind of research to do imaging. It's actually quite expensive. So we have a researcher at the University of British Columbia, just north of here in Vancouver, Dr. Laura Boyd, and at the University of Southern Illinois, Dr. Greg Rose. And we're doing similar studies looking at students with learning difficulties and the intervention. And we're seeing very similar results, which hopefully within the next year will be published in peer-reviewed journals. So we had to adapt the reasoning exercise for the scanner, because if you've ever been in an fMRI, like, you can barely move, you have to lie. So, but what I wanted the researcher to do was scan the students prior to intervention and scan them 3 months in. Because what we see with students all around the world in this program is that about the 2 to 3 month mark, they start to experience cognitive change. Like they start to be able to do things they couldn't do before. And parents start to notice that, teachers start to notice that, people around them start to notice that. So I wanted to see, was something actually happening in the brain at the 3 month mark? So we can see at time point 0 with the reasoning exercise, the brain is processing quite inefficiently. It's taking up a lot of real estate to do that activity. And again, this is very preliminary data. And we've got more data. We've got, I think, 10-month data now that's being analyzed. But what we were seeing at 3 months, much more efficient processing, less real estate taken up to do that reasoning activity as a result of the intervention. And another thing that we're finding in this preliminary data is, if we look at the first, you take the time activity at 1, time activity at 2, subtract the 2, and see, is there something different between the 2 time points that's consistent? And what we're seeing is the insula is changing. It's that little area in the bottom slide that's kind of lit up on the left-hand side all the way across, and all the students doing the reasoning exercise. And to me it makes sense, because one of the jobs of the insula is to attach meaning to things. It's to process information and make sense out of it, which is what I had difficulty with and what that exercise shifted for me. And then what is also really positive is we're seeing change in the prefrontal cortex, so the front part of the brain. I don't know whether this works, but it's, so here you can see at time point 0, there's very little prefrontal cortex activation. And here at 3 months, significant. This is the most important part of our brain. This is the part that you probably use every day in your job. This is thinking, problem solving, strategizing, it's analyzing a situation. It's, you've got a problem in front of you to solve, and what happens is this is the part of the brain that activates first to start to call in resources of how am I going to solve that problem? What am I going to do? And then as you're trying to solve the problem, this is the area that allows you to reflect on the results. So, this isn't working over here. What do I have to do? Like, how do I have to modify it? It's that constant feedback loop as you're solving a problem. We know students with learning difficulties struggle with that, and that's what we're seeing at the 0 time point, is they're not using that part of the brain very efficiently or effectively. At time point 3, they're starting to use that. And that's what we see behaviorally. We see these students become better problem solvers, better executive functioning. So to me, it's really exciting that we're seeing the behavior, and now we're actually seeing the most important part of the brain shifting. We're also doing another study at UBC with this researcher, and this is working with people with traumatic brain injury. And we're just finishing 9 months of data collection. These are individuals that were in car accidents, pretty significant trauma. I mean, a lot of them had been in comas. We got them several years after the traumatic event, which means any spontaneous remission would happen. Over the years, I mean, my work is designed for people with learning difficulties, but over the years, we had people come in, because the brain is the brain, with traumatic injury, and we saw results. So we thought, let's study this, and especially you can't open the newspaper now without reading about concussion injuries, even blast injuries, people coming back from the various war situations. And what we're finding, the research actually was just published just presented last week in the Netherlands. The researchers are really excited. They've got the 3-month data analyzed. They're just starting to analyze the 6-month data. The end of March will be the 9-month data. So by July, we should have publications. The research has just been accepted in the Journal for the Frontiers of Neuroscience. But we're seeing changes in connectivity, the similar kinds of changes that we're seeing in the students with learning difficulties. So change in connectivity in the brain, some change in myelin, which is, again, that connectivity. And we're seeing change in what's called fluid cognition. So the first kind of striped section are the people with a traumatic brain injury. Prior to intervention, the blue are just normal students or individuals without traumatic brain injury. And the red in the middle is where they are 3 months after. So you can see they're starting, and it's a significant change, starting to move up to normal. And why is fluid cognition important? This is that thinking, problem solving, being able to step into a situation, figure it out, and operate in that situation. So it's critical for life. And we're seeing changes on other measures. So really, I'm very excited because the work can now be of benefit for people not just with learning difficulties, but with people with traumatic injury. And again, what are some of the areas like auditory memory? This is the person that goes to the grocery store, like you send them out, can you buy me 3 things? You don't write it down, you just tell them, they come back with only 1 thing because they can't hold the information, or the child that comes home and knows they have homework, but kind of no idea exactly what that homework is because they can't hold the information. And often they get labeled as being irresponsible because they don't do what you ask them to do. And truly, if they have a difficulty here, they're not irresponsible, they just can't hold the information. I know people that have Post-it notes all up around their house because they have this problem. If they don't have their notes or their to-do list, they aren't going to remember what they have to do. Then number sense or quantity blindness. I've worked with a lot of people, but one that kind of stands out was a psychiatrist in Toronto, and she would double book clients because she kind of had no idea of really what was 60 minutes. It wasn't that she wanted to make more money by having 2 clients in the same time period, but she just struggled with that. She struggled with balancing her checkbook. I worked with an opera singer that couldn't do time signature in music because of this area. We addressed the cognitive function. She was able to do her musical theory exam. The individual that struggles with motor planning, this was a student that couldn't put their thoughts down on paper. So you've probably met people like this. They tell you a story. It can be really elaborate. You put a pen in their hand. Nothing much goes down on paper. It's because they've got the thoughts in the ideational content. There's nothing wrong with their thoughts. It's just the motor system that's translating the thoughts into a motor plan for writing isn't working properly. This was the same student 11 months later, same 10 minutes, went on for 3 pages. We didn't teach him how to handwrite. We changed his brain's ability to get his thoughts down onto paper. Just really quickly, another area, this is in the right hemisphere. This is what one researcher calls cognitive Goldilocks. We've all met people with this difficulty. It's where they look at a situation, nonverbal, a social situation. They kind of take one clue or cue from that situation. They don't look at everything going on. They make an interpretation, which isn't the full interpretation, and then they act on that. So they get into trouble socially. They're considered sort of inept or awkward because they haven't read all the information and interpreted it correctly. A good negotiator has to be really strong here because they have to walk into a negotiation and they have to do that minute-by-minute reading of what effect am I getting? Am I, getting, the situation to move in the direction I want it to move? An example is, if we look at this picture, I gave it to a 12-year-old girl who had really significant social problems. Nobody in her neighborhood would play with her. In fact, everybody said she lies all the time. I asked her what was happening in this picture, and she told me they were playing badminton. And I asked her why she thought that, and it's sort of hard to see in this picture, but this woman has netting on her hat. And this is severe premature closure. She looked at the netting, it triggered an association, badminton net, badminton, they're playing badminton. She didn't look at all the rest of the information. So in her nonverbal world, her social world, it wasn't that she was lying, she just misinterpreted things all the time, and there are lots of examples. Another girl looked at this, she was 18, and she told me they were at City Hall in Toronto. And I've been to City Hall many times, and I didn't really think it looked quite like that. And she pointed to the rope in the foreground. And she'd been to City Hall the week before, and there was an area cordoned off with a rope. So again, that premature closure, she looked at one element, interpreted it, and ran with that interpretation. In both cases, we addressed this cognitive function. The 12-year-old is now 30. She's, successful in the world. She can read nonverbal interpretation, and so is the other individual. So again, we're not teaching them, skills or rules, because there is no rule book for life. You've got to go into all these situations and be able to handle the situations in real time, and that's what we're giving the brain's ability to do. I'm just going to kind of cover this and then open for questions. I work with a lot of adults in my school in Toronto and a number of the schools. Here, there's a school in Redmond, Eton Arrowsmith Academy, that works with adults as well. And I see a lot of adults that have what I call a cognitive mismatch. This is where the demands of their job aren't quite aligned with their cognitive profile. So if we think about that auditory memory, I worked with a pilot, an airline pilot once, and he couldn't hold all of the instructions from the air traffic controller. And I found that a little worrisome. His strategy was to have the air traffic controller repeat the instructions over and over. But I thought, what if you're flying into Chicago O'Hare or Atlanta, that are really busy airports, and that air traffic controller really doesn't have time to repeat those instructions, and he can't remember them. So my joke was, if I was ever flying, I wanted to know what airspace he was flying in, so I didn't fly in the same airspace. But the better strategy was address the problem, which we did, and now he can listen to the information once and hold it. If we think about that, object recognition, what I call the refrigerator dysfunction, I worked with a pathologist, or he was doing his residency in pathology at a teaching hospital in the US. He had that difficulty, and he didn't really know he had that difficulty. He was examining breast tissue. It was somebody that had had cancer, breast cancer, and she'd gone through traditional treatments. So she'd gone through chemotherapy and radiation, and now it was to see, was she in remission? And he knew how important this was, so he was really careful. He was diligent. He was looking at that slide, and he was just about to sign off that the person was in remission when his supervisor came and said, "Didn't you see these cells up here? This is cancer." And it's not that he hadn't seen them, he hadn't recognized them, because he hadn't held the look to match it up to that. So he knew he was in serious trouble. He exited out of his residency program. We worked on that cognitive function. He now will never make that mistake. But I think there are a lot of what we call human error, and some of it can be explained by these cognitive mismatches. That kinesthetic, that problem I had where you don't interpret sensation or register sensation on your left side of your body. I've had some students that think it's a great idea to get a motorcycle, and they can't register sensation and don't kind of regulate their body movement, and have a number of accidents on that motorcycle because it plays into that difficulty. So, what have I learned? Every part of the brain is critical. If anybody says you only use 10% of your brain, tell them, well, I'm not going to swear, tell them that they're not accurate, because over the course of the day, you use every part of your brain. And if there's something that's not working in the way that it's designed to work, it will have some impact. Most of us can compensate, or we just avoid those things that are hard for us. Obviously, a lot of the students that I work with, from age 6, the oldest person I've worked with is 81, these are things where they pile up. They have multiple areas that are coming together that cause difficulty, and where they cannot really effectively compensate. My vision is to get this work, starting in grade 1, every child coming to school learns curriculum, which is what we all do, but what do we learn with? We learn with our brain. So part of their day is devoted to cognitive exercises to stimulate function. And what would that do? It would mean the students now that by grade 3 or 4 would get identified will never get identified, because by grade 3 or 4, these problems will be addressed. it'll become a normal part of curriculum, so there'll be no stigma, because there's tremendous stigma still attached to having a learning difficulty. Students with unevenness in their profile. I worked with a student, his mechanical reasoning was at the 50th percentile, which is average. He wanted to be an architect. You need to be at the 98th percentile. I created my mechanical reasoning exercise for him, got him to the 98th percentile. He's now been an architect for 15 years. That would get addressed, in those early grades. Any child can benefit from cognitive stimulation. And when I wrote my book, I put that as my vision at the end of the book. And I was convinced I would never see that in my lifetime. Well, we're in a school in South Carolina. I call it my whole cohort model. The whole grade 2 class is doing 2 of my cognitive exercises. This is their second year, seeing really good results. We're just starting in a public school in just north of Sydney in Australia. They're taking their whole grade 1 class. These are just regular grade 1 kids. We're doing that motor planning exercise. If we go into the university in Spain, we'll just, have all the students working on that reasoning exercise. So the vision is gradually happening, and it just has huge applications for changing the face of education, and that's what I'm passionate about, giving children and young adults and adults a different possibility in their life, like having many more doors open to them and where they can make choice of what door do I want to walk through rather than having most doors closed and only one possibility. So I just want to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
We have a microphone over here for anybody who wants to take questions or ask questions. Just raise your hand.
Thank you for the talk. That was really interesting. So you emphasize that most of your work is done or focuses on people who have learning disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Have you tested these same kind of techniques on patients with Alzheimer's or other sorts of degenerative diseases of the brain?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think a lot about that. The answer is really no, I haven't. My concern is if there's a neurodegenerative process, I don't believe we know enough yet to be able to reverse that. There's certainly research coming out that good cognitive stimulation maybe can stave off the onset by a number of years. I mean, there's a lot of good research looking at people that have dual language, which adds cognitive load, cognitive complexity, and the research is suggesting maybe it's 5 years later that they show the signs if they're going to get Alzheimer's. So I think good cognitive stimulation is positive. Whether it's going, I don't think we know enough at this point to say that it's going to prevent that. Yeah.
Have you come across any examples where a learning disability has manifested itself as a learning super ability in some other context?
I haven't. I mean, I've seen really unevenness in profiles where somebody can be exceptional in one area and have significant difficulty in another. But I haven't seen, there's this concept that I've heard out there that there's a gift of having a learning disability. I've talked to a lot of people who have learning disabilities. Nobody considers it a gift. It doesn't mean that maybe it teaches you, if you can, ways to compensate and work around, but I myself do not see the giftedness in having a learning disability. It's a struggle. It causes suffering. You just have to work so much harder than everybody else to function. Now, I have seen some students where because of, they have a difficulty here, they have a strength here, and if they rely on that strength over and over and over again, they're probably creating their own cognitive stimulation, and they actually improve that strength. It doesn't change the learning difficulty, it improves the strength that they have. I mean, for me, I think I always had a good auditory and visual memory, but I supercharged them. I mean, my way of studying, I'd lay my books out on my bed. As a child, I would cry from the depths of my soul, which I was putting my brain in kind of a Zen state, which I didn't know at the time. And then I would read the first sentence, close my eyes, see it, read the next sentence, close my eyes, see it. By the end, I could look at the first sentence, I could close my eyes, and I could see 50 pages of my notebook. I had a good ability there. I think I enhanced that ability through using it all the time and overusing it.
Hi, thanks for being here. I was just wondering, even in your personal example, you go through these training curriculums and you try to identify the problem and find a solution. after the person like kind of enhances that ability wherever they were weak, is something they have to do to continue that, or is it kind of like if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing?
Interestingly, what we see, 'cause that's a really good question, is there's no drop-off. I've tracked myself and other people, over 30 years out of the program. And I think why, because we know if we stop going to the gym, our muscles atrophy. But I think what happens is, if we think about that functional system, like all these areas coming together in a neural network, if there's some weak areas, they're acting as a drag on that whole system, right? Once you improve them, enhance them, they come up, and then they get their own stimulation by being engaged in that neural network. That's my theory. It makes sense to me. Practically, what I see is once they've achieved the gain, there's no drop-off in function, because I believe they're starting to use it in everyday functioning.
Have you noticed any difference between children and adults, or how neuroplasticity changes with age?
Yeah, when I first started this work, there was all this research. There's this beautiful window of neuroplasticity that starts to close at age 12, and it's kind of all over at age 12. So I thought I would see a big difference in, the rate of progress in children versus, adolescents, adults, young adults. I haven't seen that. It really was probably the biggest surprise that I found. I've seen variability in plasticity, which makes sense. There's individual variability in everything. And there's a lot of research now looking at genetics, looking at what goes into different rates of plasticity. I've got lots of examples in my work where, two people come in, they look very similar in the profile, same gender, same age, do the same amount of work. They both make progress, but one goes 4 times faster than the other, and then there's probably just more plasticity in that individual. But, I think about the 74-year-old, retired professor from the medical school at University of Toronto. She came in, she had face blindness, it always bothered her, worked on it. She made the same progress as a 15-year-old. So to me, it's just, I'm getting older, it's really encouraging. There's neuroplasticity over the lifespan. Yeah.
Big shout out to Google for the toolkit that you've developed. It's really enabled us to provide solutions for Barbara and her team that are very effective. We use the App Engine. All of our software runs in the App Engine. Barbara's team is not technologists. They're educators. They're scientists. They're neuroscientists. They don't run IT shops. The cloud has enabled them to deliver 724 solutions around the world to many different countries. What we've worked on with them is capturing all that data from those students that we talked about earlier and analyzing it and coming up with individual programs for every kid, every student, be them adults, whatever, and then also tracking their progress through those exercises as they're working on it and stimulating their brain, registering the data from year to year, and keeping track of that and producing reports and report cards. And it's your platform that enables that. As the next phase, we're going to get into the classroom, and as we get into the classroom, there's interactions with the students and interactions based with the teachers and student interactions. We're going to use the Android tablet for that, and the Android operating system to connect between the browser, which we use the GWT toolkit, running on App Engine, and the Android solutions that are running on the tablet to talk between the teacher and the student in the same classroom. So big shout out, we're using a lot of your tools, not to mention the Chrome browser, and it's working out really well for Barbara and her team. Thank you.
If Americans are more into ketchup than Canadians, then why do they only sell potato chips in Canada? Sorry, just kidding.
Oh, really? You don't have ketchup potato chips?
We do not have those here.
Oh,
no.
Really? Well, no loss.
I do actually have a real question that I'm curious about. And you mentioned that you didn't learn how to read an analog clock until you're 26, and similarly, you didn't understand different sorts of abstract relationships until that point.
Yeah.
I'm wondering where were you in life at that point? Had you graduated from college at that point? Had you already gone to school?
Yeah.
Did you drop out and then do it after you kind of figured things out?
Yeah. Or? No, I'd managed to get up. I was in graduate school, but incredible struggle. In my undergraduate, I learned the routines of the security guards in the library because I would spend all night in the library. So I would know when they were coming to do their little walkabout, I would hide out in the washroom. I worked 5 days a week, or no, so 7 days a week, 20 hours, every single day, just to tread water. I mean, that's what it took, because I wasn't understanding conceptually. I was having to rely on memory, which is really brute force. I compromised my immune system. I have immune system disorder. There's a lot of research now looking into the field of learning disabilities and seeing a connection. It's all the stressors that affect your endocrine system. So, I mean, it wasn't just a learning disability. It affected all sorts of things in my life. And just before I came across the book that was given to me, when I was 13, I attempted suicide. Wasn't successful. It was kind of that two-edged sword, the despair of having the learning difficulty, thinking, I've got to go to high school. I could barely get through elementary school. How can I do this? So that despair led me to try to end my life. But my learning disability meant I didn't really understand the instructions of how you did that. I mean, I can laugh at it now. So I wasn't successful, but when I woke up the next morning, because I thought you did something, you went to bed, you just didn't wake up. When I woke up the next morning, it was another opportunity to attack myself, like I just couldn't even get that right. But just before I came across this work, this time I was planning again. And this time I would have got it right, because I knew what I had to do. So that's why I feel like I owe a life debt to Luria's work, because that turned my life around. Like there was no future. Yes, I was in graduate school. Maybe I would have got through. I'm not sure whether I would have or not. But I mean, there was no life. I didn't have relationships. I mean, I couldn't, like, if I got on an elevator in my university and one of my professors got on, I was terrified that they would ask me a question, because I wouldn't be able to understand what they were asking and be able to have a conversation. Like, I lived in terror all the time. So.
Just kind of, I guess, in all your research and with working with so many different clients, any like tips that you would provide just in general for overall cognitive well-being?
Yeah. A few. I do have slides in here, but I didn't get to them. I mean, one of the best things you can do, exercise, aerobic exercise. There's tons of research now. Like, I know you've got bikes here, you've got walking trails. Like, it doesn't have to be more than, go out and walk like 30 minutes a day, a good, nice, brisk walk. Like, aerobic exercise, the rule is it's good for your heart, it's good for your brain. It stimulates, it's called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that generates, neurogenesis, creating new neurons. Also, it repairs cells, like sort of all that damage that happens over time. So if you can only do one thing, get out there and at least 5 days a week, do some good aerobic exercise. Another thing, reduce stress. I mean, all the research is showing now that stress actually is almost like an acid bath for your brain. I mean, short-term stress, not a problem. It's that long-term chronic stress, which actually creates negative neuroplasticity. When those dendrites starting to branch, it actually eats up the dendrites. So anything, whether it's meditation, again, sometimes going for a walk. Whatever you can do to reduce stress in your life is good for brain health. Whatever you can do to increase aerobic activity is good for brain health. And then if you want to, the other thing is sort of novelty and cognitive complexity, which I talked a little bit about. So let's say you want to learn something new. What you should do is calibrate the level of the challenge, right? So let's say, you want to learn chess, but you're not going to start at the grandmaster level, right? Because if you do, like, let's say you're functioning here and you try to start the activity way up here, you aren't going to be able to engage. It's not going to drive neuroplastic change. If you make it so easy that as soon as your brain goes on automatic pilot, and it's not, I mean, there are lots of times when you want to be on automatic pilot, but if you're trying to drive neuroplastic change, automatic pilot doesn't do it. So if you're making something too simple, it's not engaging the brain. So it's kind of finding that sweet spot, just like in exercise. Like, if this is where it starts to hurt a little bit, make it just a little bit more difficult. Then do the activity, and then you'll find it'll step up, right? And then make it a little more difficult. It's calibrating the level of complexity. And you can do that in any activity, that you're engaging in, and that will be the best thing to drive neuroplastic change. So exercise, reduce stress, and calibrate the level of difficulty in your learning.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.